Bet the board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Fuhrman.
And once again, this is Brad Powers filling in for Todd Fuhrman and Payne Insider once again as we continue our countdown of the 2024 Conference Preview Series. We are finishing up the Group of 5 previews with today's podcast. We are talking teams out of the American Conference, a conference that's had a lot of turnover as far as what it was just 3-4 years ago and what it is currently in 2024. Before we get to all that, I am going to remind you all that Todd and Payne will be back next week as we start up our Power 4 conference previews with the ACC. Also, another announcement at the end of this podcast, we will have not one, but 2 season win total best bets. We are doubling back on the MAC. We'll have one out of that conference as far as a season win total best bet now that it's a little bit more widely available. And then we'll have a best bet on the conference that we're talking today, and that would be the American Conference. And since there's 14 teams, I'm not going to give you general thoughts on what I feel about the conference. I'm just going to start right in on the teams. You should know the drill by now. We go worst to first, and at the bottom, as far as my power ratings entering 2024, is going to be the Temple Owls, easily a bottom 5 team in the country. And doesn't look much better as far as what they've been here recently and what they have in store for 2024. Stan Drayton, their head coach, enters his 3rd season. I'll come out with a hot take right now. I think this is his last season, in my opinion. You look at what Temple, I just mentioned, how far this program's dropped in a short period of time. From 2015 to 2019, Temple went 43-24. Last 4 years, 10-33. I went and looked at the average power rating, end-of-season power rating for Temple, comparing those 5 years, 2015 to 2019, and comparing it to the last 4. Average power rating during those seasons, the drop-off has been 23 points, meaning 2015 to 2019 Temple favored over 23 points over the last 4 years of what Temple's been. I'm not sure there's a bigger drop-off in the country as far as an average power rating. Last year's team wasn't good. Number 112 in yards per play margin, 117 yards per game margin, number 129 in scoring margin, minus 20 in turnovers. They didn't take care of the football. Going to have to do a little bit better job, to say the least, in that regard this year. Main issue was the defense. 120 in the country in yards per play, 124 in yards per game, 127 in scoring. And this year, when we're just talking personnel, bottom 5 in the country in returning production. So a bad team last year, nobody coming back from that bad team this year. The roster's been completely turned over the last 2 years. 86 new players. If you're counting transfers and freshmen just in the last 2 years alone, 86. Last I checked, there's 85 scholarships. So almost an entirely different roster in just a little bit less than 2 year period. Most of the guys last year, rewatching the film, I liked were on offense, starting with the quarterback, E.J. Warner, Kurt Warner's son. He's thrown for more than 3,000 yards each of the last 2 years. And if you just watch the games that he was in the lineup and the games that he wasn't, because he's banged up and missed a couple games last year, I mean, it was night and day as far as the effectiveness of the Temple offense. Problem for Temple, E.J. Warner transferred to Rice. Big pickup for Rice. Horrific the transfer as far as the prospects for Temple in 2024 for the Owls. They brought in a transfer themselves, and Emmon Simon from Rutgers. He's going to battle Forrest Brock for the quarterback job. As far as the other personnel on offense, 2 of their top 3 rushers depart. They're going to be okay. The Smith kid at running back and a Maryland transfer, Littleton, who's 240 pounds. I don't think there's a drop-off too much at running back. David Martin Robinson, a tight end last year. I mean, you can make a case that he's the best tight end in the history of Temple football. He departs. Their big play guy, Anderson, at wide receiver, averaged 17.5 yards per catch last year. He's gone. They got a couple guys to work with, Dante Wright and Zane Baines. They combined for nearly 1,000 receiving yards last year. They return. couple guys back as far as starters on the offensive line, but they lost their top guy, their first-team All-American, Victor Stoffel. He transferred to Cal, so that's not great news there. A total 4 starters coming back on offense, not great, especially when that was the better side of the football. On the other side of the football, the defense, lose their top 6 tacklers, and they're changing to a 4-3. So not much to work with there. Their top defensive player last year, McGee, had 14 tackles for loss. He actually got drafted in the 5th round. So by far their best player gone. Keep an eye, though, on the positive side. This DeJuan Black kid had 9.5 tackles for loss last year, dominated this year's spring game. Yeah, I was catching highlights of the Temple spring game this year. He had 6 sacks, so he might be their game-changing guy off the edge this year. The worst news of all for Temple, though, is their schedule. Currently, I have Temple projected an underdog in all 12 games, and all of them by at least 5 points. So I do not like the prospects of Temple winning more than 3 games. In fact, I think 2-10 is probably the most likely record for Temple this year. You can do with that information with what you want, and if they're 2-10, or heck, even if they're 3-9, I'm not sure that Stan Drayton gets year number 4. Let's talk next team on the docket. Charlotte, number 115 in my power ratings. Second year for Biff Poggi and his coordinators. Charlotte hasn't had much success, just one winning season in 9 years of FBS play. Last year, 3-9. Stats say they were a 3-9 type of team. They're 120 in yards per play margin, 110 in yards per game margin, number 121 in scoring margin. Offense was the issue for them. 123 in yards per play, 117 in yards per game, 126 in scoring margin. But there's a little bit more to work with than let's say, a Temple team. You look at just the talent, influx, and outflow as far as this roster and how it's constructed. They had 29 transfers out. Only 4 of them went to Power 4 schools. They bring in 19 Power 4 transfers. So only 4 of the 29 transfers that left the program went to Power 4 schools. They bring in 19 players that were on Power 4 rosters last year. So upgraded talent a little bit there. They lose their main quarterback, Jones, who was also their leading rusher. Ivy Kid got plenty of starts last year, but he only threw 4 touchdown passes compared to 10 picks. And I expect the Florida transfer, Mac Brown, to be the starter. Rewatching last year's games where he got in, he actually started late. I liked what I saw mobility-wise from him in the Missouri game last year. He still has some things to work on in the pass game, though. Top 2 running backs return. Neither of them really impressed me. I think they're going to go again. This sounds like a broken record. Couple Power 4 transfers, an Iowa State transfer, Norton, and a Michigan transfer, C.J. Stokes. I think those will be the top 2 guys this year, even with Charlotte returning their top 2 running backs. The Weber kid at tight end, I really like. The Florida game was the game I really focused in and watched a bunch of the snaps from that game. He jumped off the tape. I checked PFF, and he ended up grading as their top player on offense. Not surprising after what I saw in the Florida game. The leading receiver, Mack, returns. He averaged 18 yards per catch last year, so that's a positive. Not a positive is only one starter back on the offensive line, and one of their top offensive players was Jasper Parks on that offensive line. However, once again, they bring in several Power 4 transfers, and in fact, at just the offensive line position group itself, I could see 3 of those guys coming in from Power 4 schools starting for them this year. On defense, they lose their top 3 tacklers. The linebacker, Demetrius Knight, went to South Carolina. I think he's going to be an impact player for the Gamecocks this year, so that's a big loss for Charlotte there. Hill Green transferred to Colorado. Their best pass rusher, Oki Anoma, from last year, he had 11.5 TFLs. He's gone. Top defender backs, a cornerback, Balfour, had 11 PBUs last year. I like their nose tackle, Des Morgan, in the middle. He's a 300-plus pounder. They like this Stone Handy kid at Buck linebacker coming off the edge. They expect him to have a breakout season. So there's some pieces to work with. Problem, once again, one of the tougher group of 5 schedules. Right now, I only have Charlotte favored in 1 game. That's in their FCS game against Gardner-Webb. I don't see a bowl this year. I like Biff Poggi as a head coach, and I think he's making some in-grounds. It just isn't happening as fast as he wants it. So I'm not sure that they are slam dunk to even top last year's 3 wins. So that's how difficult the schedule is. Not that I'm down on Charlotte, though. I think they're live in week 1 against JMU. Another little bit tidbit there. Let's move on, because again we got 12 more teams left here. Tulsa's next up, another coach entering his second year. Kevin Wilson and both coordinators are entering year 2. They had a 4-8 season a year ago. They had lost 6 straight games prior to the season finale where they won. It was a thrilling game on a last-second field goal against East Carolina. Again, they probably deserve to be even worse if you look at their stats from last year. 125 in yards per play margin, 108 in yards per game margin, 117 in scoring margin. Defense was the issue with Tulsa. 127 in yards per play, 128 in yards per game, 119 in scoring. FYI, there's only, if you're hearing a lot of 127 this, 128 that, there's only 133 teams last year in college football. So we're talking bottom 5, bottom 10 statistically for Tulsa on defense last year. Positive side, they were 1-4 in close games. That usually means regression, a little bit more positive outlook for this year. Another positive for Tulsa, they signed the number 54 recruiting class. That's their best finish in about a quarter century. None of their previous 4 classes were ranked in the top 110. And again, they signed the number 54 class. Does that really significantly help them this year? No, but I mean, when you're reading tea leaves for future years, there's going to be a talent upgrade here at Tulsa if they give Kevin Wilson time to build out this roster. Top 2 quarterbacks return for them on offense. I really like the Kirk Francis kid. Speaking of freshmen, he played at the end of last season in the last 3 games. I thought the offense started looking better, particularly in that East Carolina game. They bring in Cooper Legas from Utah State to compete for the job. I think Francis actually still wins it. Top 2 rushers returning. I like Anthony Watkins. He ran for nearly 900 yards a year ago. Another kid that I like is Benjamin at wide receiver. He averaged 15.5 yards per catch last year. Negative, they lost their 3rd and 4th leading wide receivers from last year to Houston post-spring practice this spring. A couple guys to keep an eye on, a couple transfers. Ballard from UTEP at wide receiver. Braylon Presley at wide receiver from Oklahoma State. I think they'll fill the gap in from those 2 kids that went to Houston. 2 starters back on the offensive line. And I would argue that's easily probably the offense's biggest concern, or at least question mark at this point. Lost a ton, though, on the defensive side of the ball. A ton of production out the window. Ray at safety, 131 tackles, led the conference in tackles. I told Payne about this kid last year prior to the season. I was like, hey, if your Knowles are sniffing around looking to need safety help, that Ray kid from Tulsa is pretty good. Ended up leading the entire league in tackles. Pretty good player. He's gone. Julian Simon, 10 TFLs for them, gone. Kopensky, Ben Kopensky, 8.5 sacks, the best pass rusher, gone. Oliver at nickel, 4 interceptions. He transferred to TCU. He was an impressive player. I mean, 3 of those 4 players I just mentioned were first or second team all-conference, so a lot of production from Tulsa, from a bad Tulsa defense gone. Anybody that was worth a damn isn't coming back this year, except maybe a couple guys. Their edge player, Ostrowski, 10 TFLs for him. He does return. They got to fill in the gaps with transfers, obviously. Miles Jackson from Indiana at the jack linebacker position. They look for him to be an instant impact player. Gavin Potter was a multiple-year starter at Kansas. He comes in. Chris Thompson from USC, also at linebacker. They bring him in. So some experienced Power 4 conference players. They'll take a step back maybe in some regards on defense, but it won't be that big of a step back. As far as pricing this team out, I got 6 of their games priced at 6 points or less, so we'll see if they can clean up the turnovers and the mistakes. And I'm looking for like a 5-7 type of season for Tulsa this year. Let's move on to the Service Academy, Navy. Speaking of another coach entering his second season, Brian Newberry in his second season. Up and down year 1 for him. I was there in person with Payne and Todd. We lost to Army at the goal line for a second straight season. Anytime you lose to Army in that game, you can't then say it was a successful season when you lose to your arch rival. And speaking of losing, Navy 4 straight losing seasons, 16-30 since Malcolm Perry led them to an 11-2 record in 2019. Just they've certainly dropped off. Last year, number 99 in yards per play margin, 104 in yards per game margin, number 91 in scoring margin nationally. Offense was the problem for them, 119 in yards per play, 126 in yards per game, 125 in scoring. One thing that they did last year because of the new cutback rules in college football, they had 199 pass attempts. That's the most here in several decades at Navy. They tried to adjust the new cut block rules, and it hasn't worked out for them. They do have a new offensive coordinator, the chronic guy from Mercer. He was the head coach He's been a very successful head coach. He's been at 3 different stops, and he's 75-23. He took Mercer to their first ever FCS playoff appearance last year. I bet FCS football last couple of years. I would say that I've won with Mercer against the spread about as much as any team, betting on him consistently week after week. So I really am a big fan of him. He's a Mercer head coach now, the offensive coordinator in Navy. He runs like a hybrid wing T type of offense. He calls it sometimes he refers to it as a sling T. So what does it look like? A lot of different motions, creates some mismatches on the edges. Right up Navy's alley if they're looking to maneuver some of these new cut block rules that are at a disadvantage. I think they hired the perfect guy to maybe manage that a little bit. As far as personnel for Navy goes, lose their top 2 quarterbacks, Lavatai and Xavier Arline. Looks like Blake Horvath's going to be the favorite to start over Braxton Woodson there. Top 2 rushers are back. Teska and Fofana at fullback. Both of those guys are back. They both flashed for multiple years now. So it's good for Navy that they got guys that have been productive players for each of the last 2 years coming back for another year. Top 2 receivers are back. The Heinen Rick kid averaged 20 yards per catch last year. They like the speed of this Nathan Kent kid who was a sprinter on the track team. So there's a lot of pieces to work with on this offense. Also, on the offensive line, 3 starters are back there. Connor McMahon's their right tackle. He's probably their best offensive lineman. Let's talk defense. There's some studs to work with on defense. First team All-American weak side linebacker Colin Ramos returns. 110 tackles last year. Lane at free safety I like a lot. He's flashed to me on tape for multiple seasons. He had 12 passes defensed a year ago. Peely at cornerback. He picked off 4 passes. He comes back. They got a couple of edge rushers. Pierce and Reed combined for 9 sacks and 17.5 TFLs. They're back. So a lot, for a service academy, a lot of experience coming back for Navy. Biggest loss for them, Harbor at middle linebacker. But again, they like his replacement, this Job Grant kid. They think he has great measurables. Really impressed in the spring. So keep an eye on Job Grant is his name at middle linebacker. I don't mention this much as far as the special teams when we're breaking down the team, but the Rithman kid at punter, probably the best in school history, he's back. So a lot of positive for Navy this year to make a step and get back to bowl eligibility. The problem is, the schedule's tough. It might be only favored in 3 or 4 games. My numbers actually say bet under 5.5 on Navy. I think my computer's got it at 5.1 to be exact, but I haven't yet because I'm going to respect this new offensive coordinator again because I've won a lot of money with them on Mercer the last couple of years. So we'll see if Navy can surprise a few folks this year as far as possibly getting back to a bowl game. Let's talk the newbie to the conference, and that is, I just got done talking Navy. Let's talk their arch rival, Army, who joins the American this year. SMU out the door, replaced by Army. Their first time in a conference since they left Conference USA more than a decade ago. It didn't work out for them. We'll see if this works out for them here. As far as the positive from Army, I think it's the coaching continuity. Jeff Monken's entering his 11th season. He's been a winner, to say the least here. 70-55. That's good for Army. 4-1 in bowl games. But haven't been to a bowl game the last 2 years. The back-to-back 6-6 seasons with no bowls, but did beat Navy at the goal line. Like I mentioned it, not only last year, but each of the last 2 years. Came down to a final play on the goal line. Army's won both of them. Probably getting back after Navy won, 14 in a row, and a bunch of those were close. So it's funny how that works. Army comes in a little bit red hot, won their last 4 games of the season. Their defensive coordinator, speaking of coaching continuity, Nate Woody's back for his 5th season. Man, statistically, they weren't great, though, last year. 101 in yards per play margin, 104 in yards per game margin, 78 in scoring margin. Problem is the offense, like Navy, struggling with the new cut block rules. So they were only 120 in yards per game and 113 in scoring. They brought in a new offensive coordinator, Cody Worley. But actually, he took over the play calling at the end of last season when they won those 4 games at the end. That they were mainly in shotgun last year. Bryson Daly, their quarterback, led the team and also led the team in rushing. He attempted 120 passes himself, even though he missed a few games. That was the most here in Army, and again, if a couple decades. Keep in mind, because of those cut block rules, they were in the shotgun last year 80% of the time. Wasn't working out for them. They started 2-6. less shotgun down the stretch, changed up the offense coordinator. Worley started calling the plays, and they won 4. And this year they're going to be back under center. I like the move there for Army. Well, we'll see, though. It seems like the NCAA kind of had it out on the service academies with those rules a couple years ago. Positive side for Army, Udo at running back, 220 pounds. He's back. He ran for over 500 yards last year. I thought I rewatched the Army-Navy game. He looked like they're one of their best players on tape. Keep an eye on this fullback if you're looking for new guys. Rendina, 264 pounds. He's kind of a bulldozer, really impressed in the spring. Tyrell Robinson's another year removed from a knee injury. He's a very productive player when healthy. 3 of the top 4 receivers returned, but they're big play guy Alston did transfer to Iowa State. They did get a nice surprise at this offseason. Finnecane at offensive tackle, their best offensive lineman, was not supposed to come back, but he announced that he is. So they got 3 starters back on the offensive line. So 7 starters back on the offense for Army. A lot to work with there. Defense, unfortunately, only 3 returning starters. Though they had a 2-time leading tackler and Lowen at linebacker. He's gone. Jackson Powell off the edge. They'll miss him. They were hit hard in the secondary. Lost 3 starters. And that Jimmy at nickel, he was really impressive. A couple guys that I liked, Fortner, hero of the Navy game. He impressed, at least in that on tape there. D. Domenico at safety. He's another good player for them. But, again, a lot less to work with on defense than they do on offense. Tougher schedule for Army now that they're moving to conference. Keep in mind, last few years they've been playing a couple FCS schools each year. That's why they didn't go to bowl games at 6-6. You need to be 7-5 if you're playing FCS schools. They played UMass, basically an FCS team as well the last couple of years. Now they play 8 conference games. They play Air Force, Notre Dame, and the Navy game is a non-conference game. So, when you play 8 conference games plus Air Force, Notre Dame, and Navy, that's not a lot of gimmies on the schedule. I got 8 of their 12 games priced under a field goal. 6-6 looks right to me again. 3rd straight 6-6 season for Army. Let's talk. Again, going to sound like a broken record. Another coach entering his 2nd season, Tom Herman at Florida Atlantic. Disappointing first season, 4-8. They lost their last 4 games. Worst record for them since 2016. They've had 3 straight losing seasons as a program. They were a little bit better than their record as far as yards per play margin, 85. Yards per game margin wasn't good, though, at 114, but scoring margin wasn't too shabby at number 81 in the country. Well, they were 1-4 in close games, so that's why statistically they were a little bit better than a 4-8 record. 7 starters, though, unfortunately transferred to Power 4 schools. They do, however, bring in 11 transfers from Power 4 schools. Not necessarily starters, but players from the Power 4 level. Last year's quarterbacks, Daniel Richardson, Casey Thompson, they both transferred. It wasn't a banner year for FAU quarterbacks. They only had 19 touchdown passes, 15 picks. As far as this season, Tyreek Starks and a Marshall transfer, Cam Fancher, they're competing for the starting job. They like Fancher, but, if you're trying to protect the football, Fancher hasn't protected it. Last year at Marshall, 11 touchdown passes, 11 picks, so we'll see who ends up. Starks was better in the spring game, rewatching it. Top 2 rushers, Larry McCammon and Kobe Lewis, are both gone. Top 4 receivers depart. LeJonte Wester, know this name, LeJonte Wester. He's at Colorado right now. I thought he was one of the top 5, group of 5 wide receivers in the country a year ago. He was by far their best player on the team, rewatching tape. Again, big pickup for the Buffaloes. If you follow me on Twitter, I'm pretty critical of Coach Prime and Colorado. But, man, that was a good transfer addition that they got there. As far as FAU, though, replacing Wester, they brought in several transfers. Mylan Tucker, Marlon Johnson, Caleb Coombs. Okay production-wise, all 3 of them at G5 programs, so we'll see. I still think it's a downgrade at that position. Only 1 starter back on the offensive line. It is their center, though, Marengis, who graded out their best offensive lineman last year. Let's flip over to defense. Jackson Ambush. I like that name for a defensive player. Doesn't get much of a Ambush. He was their leading tackler. He's back. Day Hill is also back at corner. The problem is 5 key players that were going to be in their 2 deep on defense transferred post-spring. When you go 3-4 months into the offseason thinking you're going to have guys, and then guys transfer post-spring, I mean, that's a loss for a school like FAU. And, I mean, they're not the only one at the G5 level. It's tough to replace that in just a few short months in the summer. Speaking of Wester, he had a brother on the defense side of the ball, a linebacker, Jalen Wester. He also left for Colorado. Another guy that impressed me up front, Evan Anderson, 356 pounds. He was their nose tackle. He's gone. Their top guy in the secondary, Morris, he's gone. So, I mean, I think they'll be a little bit better this year, but, man, only 7 returning starters. I mean, I don't like the personnel as far as what Florida Atlantic has right now as far as the roster. Here's one thing I do like, though. Unlike the other teams that I've been talking about so far on this podcast, I love Florida Atlantic's schedule. I mean, I rank it right now number 133. What does that mean? It means the only team in the country that's got an easier schedule is Liberty. So FAU, very fortunate schedule. Even though I don't like the personnel, I could see Florida Atlantic being favored in 7 or so games. So I think it's a bowl season for Tom Herman in year 2. Let's talk North Texas. Another coach entering year 2. 5-7 last year. Pretty average, those stats-wise, and maybe they could have been a little bit better. 72 in yards per play margin, 57 in yards per game margin, 84 in scoring margin. Basically, it came down to this. Offense was great. Defense was horrific. Listen to these numbers. The offense, 17th in the country in yards per play. They averaged 496 yards per game. That was number 6. Scored 34.5 points per game. That was number 20 in the country. Problem is defense. Number 125 in yards per play, allowed 477 yards per game, dead last in the country, and allowed 37 points per game. That ranked 131st. So, really good offense, really bad defense. Couldn't protect the quarterback, couldn't get after the quarterback. They were minus 20 in sack margin. It's been incredible roster turnover. Tough to get a feel for what this team's going to be since Eric Morris took over. Again, in less than 2 years' time. 54 new players this year, counting fresh. Just this year, 54 new players, counting freshmen and transfers. Not counting 2 years. This year, since the end of December, 54 new players. That's the second most in the country to Colorado. Of the 26 incoming transfers, 19 are from Power 4 programs. They had 36 players transfer out, but only 8 of them went to Power 4 schools, so you could see an upgrade there as far as the talent level. Chandler Rogers, unfortunately, their quarterback, he's off to Cal. Had a really good season. 29 touchdowns, only 5 picks. Protected the football. As far as who's going to take over for Rodgers, Stone Earl took all the snaps in the spring, but I expect Chandler Morris, a TCU transfer, probably the favorite to start as soon as he gets settled in. Top 2 running backs. Adehi, he's off to James Madison. Oscar Attaway. Between Adehi and Attaway, they combined for nearly 1,800 yards, 6.6 yards per carry, 12 touchdowns. They both transferred out, so that's unfortunate. Now, I will say, Ragsdale's back from injury. He's had plenty of experience in North Texas last couple years prior to getting hurt last year. They bring in a couple Power 4 transfers, so maybe not a significant drop-off at that position. Jamori Macklin, though, really, they're by far their top wide receiver. 17.6 yards per catch, 11 touchdowns. He transferred to Kentucky. That's going to be a tough loss there. A kid who flashed late in the season, I was rewatching a bunch of their games. They had a bunch of exciting games. Landon Sides was a freshman last year, wide out. He was pretty productive. Damon Moore, Conwright were also productive, so they'll be okay at wide receiver. Top 2 offensive linemen transferred to Mississippi State and Oklahoma, respectively. They do return their left guard, Blair, who is a 2-time all-conference player. Here's the negative, though. So when I watch highlights, again, I'm not watching every play. It's not like when I say I rewatched the game, I didn't rewatch a 3.5-hour game with all the commercials. I'm looking at cut-ups and highlight reels where maybe it's 15 minutes long, but in that 15 minutes time, I'm watching 40 or 50 plays of the game. The problem is I watched 7 of their 12 games last year, rewatched them. I didn't highlight a single player. That's rare for me. Usually I watch one game, I might highlight one guy, at least on one side of the ball. So when you watch 7 games, usually I'd have 5 or 6 guys highlighted on a depth chart. 0 on defense for North Texas for me. 2 of their top 3 tacklers are back. Their top disruptor, they lose him, unfortunately. Edge player Richards, he had 10.5 TFLs. He's gone. Their nose tackle is he's okay. He just, he's not going to scare you, coming out, jumping off the bus. I mean, he's a nose tackle and he's only 275 pounds, but he was pretty productive. His name's Roderick Brown. A couple guys that keep an eye on, Isheem Young from Ole Miss. He turned some heads in spring. He's at safety. Texada's played a lot of snaps at cornerback the last few years, so we'll see. Again, a tough team to get a grasp on with so much roster turnover, especially with 54 new guys this year. Win total right now is 5.5 in the market. My projections have it 5.4. No bet for me. That's rare. I got a lot of bets in the win total market. Let's keep it rolling here. UAB's next. Another second-year coach off a losing season. Trent Dilfer. Much discussed hire, and we'll get to that in a minute here. Went 4-8 in year one. Keep in mind, UAB, the previous 6 years to Dilfer's hire, averaged 8.3 wins per season. It was their worst team in a decade. So not a very popular hire as far as the people that the meat and potatoes people, the X's and O's, or the people that bet it. They did not like the Dilfer hire at all. So far, they look vindicated at 4-8. I love the Athlon magazine because they have these opposing scouting reports. They're anonymous quotes from opposing coaches. I'm going to read you word for word what this year's Athlon magazine said about Dilfer. And this is an opposing coach talking here. A lot of us were predicting a total disaster, and when Dilfer started screaming at his own assistants on the sideline, we thought it would happen, but they ended up just being a regular bad program. Maybe he's calmed down and figured it out this season, but they're not a force in recruiting the way you need to be in a city and region like theirs. The stadium, the money in the program, it was all built up to help a head coach to keep the best of the rest home in that state and away from other G5s. That hasn't happened yet. This is still a weird and maybe even dumb hire considering how good UAB should be with the resources they have now. So that was an opposing coach. Let her fly. Not a big fan of Dilfer. As far as the record, though, they were a little bit statistically, should have been better than 4-8. They were 66 in the country in yards per play margin, 61 in yards per game margin, both positive in those two stats. They were outscored by 7 points per game. Is that bad coaching, bad luck? We'll find out more this year with some more data points. The offense was good, though. Averaged 450 yards per game. Defense, the issue, gave up 435 yards per game. Ranked number 121 in total defense. Allowed 37 points per game. That was number 130 in the country. Dilfer and both coordinators are back, obviously. Alex Mortensen, Chris Mortensen, may he rest in peace. It's his son. He did a nice job on the offensive side of the ball. They've really tried to fill out. It tells me that they didn't like the roster because they've added 9 transfers post-spring. 9 guys. So, I don't know. I got some doubts there. Quarterback, Jacob Zeno returns. He had a successful first season. Completed nearly 74% of his passes. School records as far as completions and completion percentage. Problem is he had 13 turnovers. He's got to clean that up. The big loss on offense for UAB, Jermaine Brown, their running back. I thought he was their top player on offense. He had 1,200 yards, rushing and receiving combined, 13 touchdowns. They're going to miss him. He's been a very productive player for them the last 3-4 years. Lee Beebe, as a backup running back, averaged 6.9 yards per carry. He flashed rewatching some of their games. He was actually their highest graded offensive player at Pro Football Focus. They bring in Armani Goodwin from LSU, Isaiah Jacobs, Josh Jacobs' brother. He might have been their top running back last year. He got injured early in the season, Isaiah Jacobs. So, okay, Jermaine Brown's a big loss, but they got 3 capable guys to replace him, so maybe not too big of a drop-off there. Where there is a drop-off, wide receiver Palmer, big play guy, averaged 18.3 yards per catch, went in the 6th round of the draft. They'll miss him. They get their possession receiver Thomas. He comes back after having 53 receptions a year ago. They like this Cam Shanks kid. He had a big spring game. He's really quick. They also like this Buck Calder kid. So we'll see a wide receiver there if they can fill in for Palmer. 4 starters back on the offensive line. That's good. Led by center Brady Wilson. Problem is they were expected to get all five back, but left tackle Will Parker was just dismissed a couple weeks ago in June. So a little bit of an unfortunate loss there post-spring. Speaking of losses post-spring, 3 defensive starters transferred post-spring, including both cornerbacks. They got 0 starters back in the secondary. So big negative for UAB's defense. Fish McWilliams up front, one of their better players, he's gone. They like this Kevin Penn kid, though, who had 4 sacks. I like their Jack linebacker, Little. He was the only guy I highlighted on their defense after rewatching a bunch of their games. They also like this Emmanuel Waller kid at the other defensive end position. He had a big spring game. A couple guys that they bring in, O.C. Brothers, a Purdue transfer, is a name to know. Adrian Maddox, a nickel from Alabama State's a key addition on defense. They like their middle linebacker coming back in Michael Moore. Let's talk schedule. Road trips, Arkansas, USF, Memphis are tough, but, I mean, they're going to be favored in at least 6 games. This has to be this season. It's got to be a bowl game for Dilfer. Again, he inherited a program that had averaged nearly 8.5 wins per season. He went 4-8 last year. Got to at least get the bowl game in year 2. Otherwise, he's going to have a hot seat. Let's talk East Carolina. They're next in line. Mike Houston, their coach, entering year 6. Speaking of hot seat, he's probably feeling a little bit of heat. He's only 24-34 so far. He's off his worst season at 2-10. East Carolina at 2-10 was number 109 in yards per play margin, 113 in yards per game margin, number 94 in scoring margin. They were 0-4 in close games. So 2-10, and yet they had a little bit better statistical numbers than some of the teams I've already talked about that, won 3, 4, 5 games. So when you're 0-4 in close games, that's usually a positive sign for regression the next year. On defense, Blake Harrell enters his 5th season. They did good on defense last year. That wasn't the issue. The issue was they had one of the worst offenses in college football. 132 in yards per play, 130 in total offense, 127 in scoring offense. Fired their OC. They bring in John David Baker from Ole Miss. They're going to run tempo. They're pretty excited about it. They got some talent to work with. They've signed their best back-to-back recruiting classes in 2 decades. They lost 33 players to the portal, but only 4 went to power schools. Meanwhile, 16 of their incoming 19 transfers are from Power 4 schools, so talent upgrade there. Speaking of incoming Power 4 transfers, 2 of them at quarterback, Jake Garcia from Missouri, Keaton Hauser from Michigan State. They're going to battle for the job, so they're going to get upgrade quarterback play, to say the least. Harris, their leading rusher, comes back. He impressed me on tape. Their top wide receiver, Sowell's back. They had a couple of transfers there. Winston Wright from Florida State in the slot. So some good news there. Jalen Johnson was a kid, though, that I liked at wide receiver last year. Unfortunately, he departs for him. 4 starters back on the offensive line. They didn't grade out too well. None of the offense really did last year. So we'll see if they can improve with some extra experience. Their best defender last year is probably their cornerback, Revel. Filled out a stat sheet, to say the least, with TFLs, tackles, and PBUs. He comes back. The unfortunate thing is their leading tackler, first-team All-AAC, Julius Wood, he departs at safety. They do have a couple guys that can get after the passer, though. Chad Stevens and Johnson, they returned. They had a combined 7.5 sacks. The best thing I like about East Carolina this year is the schedule. No Power 4 schools. Now, they do play App State and Liberty, 2 of the better G5 schools. But I could see this East Carolina team favored in as many as 7 games, maybe even more than that. I have 9 of their 12 games priced at 7 points or less. Went 2-10 last year, triple their win total this year. We will come back to East Carolina in about a half hour. There's a hint there on that team. Let's talk Rice. Mike Bloomgren enters his 7th season here. A lot of coaching continuity. Brian Smith, their DC, 7th season. Marquise Tuiasosopo enters his 4th season as OC. You want to talk about steady progression. 2 wins to 4 wins to 5 wins to 6 wins the last 4 years. And they somehow won 6 games, even though they were minus 14 in turnovers last year. Average team in the stats, 61 in yards per play margin, 69 in yards per game margin, 68 in scoring margin. They are, unlike most G5 schools, top 10 in the country in returning production, not bottom 10, top 10. And that's kind of surprising considering they lose JT Daniels at quarterback. But he was banged up at the end of last season. A.J. Padgett got several starts the last couple of years. The positive side for Rice, they bring in E.J. Warner. I talked about him in the Temple preview. He's the son of Kurt Warner. He's averaged the last couple of years 308 passing yards per game. Got a couple of years of eligibility. I really like E.J. Warner. That's a big pickup. Nationally, I think that's one of the more underrated incoming transfers that moves a needle for a team. Leading rusher, Dean Connors, he comes back. This is a guy that ran for almost 800 yards, and he also had 43 receptions at the running back position. Very productive players back. Unfortunately, their best player, Luke McCaffrey, on offense. He departs. He went in the third round of the draft. He's going to be he's going to be productive. Obviously, he's got the lineage in his family, and he really impressed on tape last year. He deserved to get drafted. They do return their next top 6 receivers. I like their tight end. 4 starters back on the offensive line. They lost their top guy and their tackle Servin, but they added a Georgia transfer. That's right, a Georgia transfer at Rice and Chad Lindbergh. Defense, 23 of the top 25 tacklers from last year are back. So, big positive. It actually would have been 25 for 25, but 2 of their better players, Carroll at defensive tackle and DeVones at cornerback, transferred Power 4 schools in Texas Tech and Duke, respectfully. So that's unfortunate. Those 2 guys are gone. A couple guys that are back to keep an eye on. Piercy at defensive end, 7 TFLs last year. They like this Dartmouth transfer kid coming in. He had 7.5 sacks at Dartmouth last year. I like their free safety, Gabriel Taylor. He was productive last year. He's Sean Taylor's much, much younger brother. Wears number 26. Good player there. Rice, schedule-wise, probably favored in 7 games. I think they have their first winning season in a decade. They continue that progression as far as the win total. A few more teams left here. Let's talk South Florida. Head coach Alex Golish. Both coordinators returned for their second seasons. They exceeded. I talked to a lot of first-year coaches that didn't have good first seasons. This wasn't the case for USF. Alex Golish hit it out of the park. He inherited a team that was 8-37 the previous 4 years. They went 7-6. 89 in yards per play margin, 58 in yards per game margin, 76 in scoring margin. They saved the best for last, though. Last 2 games, they won by a combined 93-14, including absolutely annihilating Syracuse in the bowl game. Offense was terrific. No surprise there. Golish came over from Tennessee. Averaged 452 yards per game. That was 17th in the country. Ran a bunch of tempo. No surprise there. Number 4 in plays per game, or plays per minute, I should say. Defense allowed 433 yards per game. Not as good there. They got to clean it up. Won a couple of close games. Another team that ranks in the top 10 as far as returning production. So trend line's really up on USF. Also signed their best recruiting class in the entire group of 5 this year, best here in a decade. So again, trend line's up on this program. New stadium and facilities are on their way. This could be one of the top G5 jobs in the country very soon. So love the trend line here. Let's talk specifics as far as this year's personnel. Quarterback Byron Brown, revelation last year. This is a kid that threw for nearly 3,300 yards, 65%, 26 touchdowns, 11 picks. Also led the team with 809 rushing yards. To put that in perspective, him and Jane Daniels, the Heisman winner from LSU, were the only quarterbacks in the country last year to top 3,000 yards passing and 800 yards rushing. Super productive. Other guys that are productive are back. Right at running back, nearly 800 yards. He comes back. Sean Atkins, a former walk-on, had over 1,000 yards receiving last year. In fact, the first 1,000-yard receiving season in the history of South Florida football going back a quarter century. First time they've ever had a 1,000-yard receiver, a former walk-on, Sean Atkins. He's back. Their big play guy, Brown, at wide receiver, unfortunately transferred to Arkansas. They bring in a Purdue transfer, Abdul-Rahim Yassin. We'll see if he can fill in the gap a little bit there. 4 starters back on the offensive line. Their top guy, though, Donovan Jennings, did depart. Offensive line was kind of a weakness last year. They allowed 43 sacks. They got to clean that up. On defense, 4 of the top 5 tacklers are back. Schuler, linebackers, their leader there. They do lose a couple of their top playmakers, though. That Evans kid had 14 TFLs. Logan scored a couple of defensive touchdowns. He transferred to Louisville. Let's talk expectations, because they're high for a team that was at the bottom of the league for 4 years, and now all of a sudden people are talking about winning the league. Tough start to the schedule. Alabama, Miami, at Tulane, and Memphis in the first 6 games. But, man, they got a chance to really close strong. They could be in favored in as many as 7 or 8 games when it's all said and done. So I think the trend line for USF on the upwards as much as any G5 team in the country right now. A few more teams left here, 3 in fact. Then we'll get to the best bets. I think we're going to get this one done in an hour. Let's talk Tulane. New coach. In fact, the only new coach this year. That shouldn't be a big surprise since they replaced half the league last year as far as coaches. But this year, Tulane has a new coach. They're off their best back-to-back seasons in modern history. They were 4-0 in close games last year. That's usually a bad sign for the upcoming season. Statistically, weren't dominant. They were 42 in yards per play margin, 52 in yards per game margin, 45 in scoring margin, despite a double-digit win season. Willie Fritz off to Houston after 8 years here, did a great job. But I got to tell you guys, Tulane cares about football now. Obviously, they built a new stadium less than a decade ago. You see what they do as far as social media presence, the uniforms, as far as their marketability, as good as any G5. And then they went out and did what good programs do. They went out and made a great hire. John Summerall went 23-4 in Troy the last 2 years, winning the Sun Belt both years. He knows how to win and win immediately. He was a co-DC here for 3 years about a decade ago, so he's got familiarity with the program. He brings over both of his coordinators from Troy. They signed their best recruiting class in 20 years, so another program that's here to stay, folks. The unfortunate thing is they got to replace a lot, though. Michael Pratt at quarterback, their all-time leading passer, is gone. Kai Horton has gotten a lot of experience the last couple of years because Pratt has been banged up. In fact, he started 3 games last year. They bring in 5-star Ty Thompson from Oregon to compete for the job. We'll see there. So it'll be a step back from Michael Pratt, but maybe not a significant one. Mekhi Hughes at running back. He was a revelation last year, ran for nearly 1,400 yards. The biggest question will be on, at least on offense, at receiver. They lost their top 3 guys. Brazel, Keys, and Jackson combined for more than 1,700 yards and 16 touchdowns. They're all gone. I like the Ballman kid at tight end, though. If you remember, he was the hero of the Cotton Bowl a couple years ago. He comes back yet again. Brown at wide receiver. They brought in Mario Williams from USC, who impressed during the spring. So they have some guys there. I just think they won't be as dynamic as what they were last year. 3 starters back on the offensive line, but they do lose their top guy. That Sincere Haynesworth kid was really good for them the last couple years. Fortunate thing for defense is top 3 tacklers are back, combined for 250 tackles last year. Machado and Tyler Grubbs, those are 2 leaders there. Patrick Jenkins somehow is back up front. He's been a couple-year starter for him. The kid that impressed me on tape, rewatching games, Devin Deal, 13 TFLs. He's off to TCU. Big pickup for the Horned Frogs there. The biggest question on defense is going to actually be the secondary. Lost their top 3 guys in the secondary. Combined for 29 PBUs, 9 interceptions. They just so happen to be the 3 highest-graded players on defense per Pro Football Focus, so some significant question marks in that secondary. The guy they like at nickel comes in from Troy, the Ransaw kid. Another key addition up front that I really like, UL Monroe, the defensive tackle Huntington. By far, UL Monroe's best player last year. Super productive, 16 TFLs, even though he's double-teamed consistently. They bring him in post-spring, so good pickup there. Another positive for Troy, or I should say Tulane, but I'm comparing them to Troy. They ran the same defenses last year, same schematics, because last year Tulane hired the Troy DC from 2022, so a lot of going to be similarities as far as terminology on defense. Let's talk schedule. They do play Kansas State and Oklahoma in the non-conference. Conference schedule is manageable. They get Memphis, USF, and Rice at home. They avoid UTSA. Probably favored in 8 or 9 games. They're not. That doesn't mean that they automatically are 9-3 or they match last year's last 2 years as far as the win total. But I think they easily make a bowl game here in year 1 for John Summerall. Another good hire for Tulane. UTSA is next. Jeff Traylor, 5th season here. I'm shocked he's still here. 39-14 so far. The last 3 UTSA teams have been the best 3 UTSA teams since they joined the FBS over a decade ago. I think he'd be a really good, like Baylor, TCU, Texas Tech type of coach, program like that. Both coordinators are back. They're a real solid team in the stats last year, 45 in yards per play margin, 42 in yards per game margin, 37 in scoring margin. The unfortunate thing is Frank Harris, who felt like he was there 15 years. He was there 7, but he's their all-time leading passer, nearly 12,000 career passing yards. He's gone. He finally lost eligibility. He wasn't healthy, though, last year. So Owen McCown, son of Josh McCown, got a bunch of snaps and was a starter in the bowl win. He split some snaps with Eddie Lee Marburger in the spring. So at least losing your all-time leading passer usually, significant downgrade. You're replacing him with a guy that hasn't had many snaps. McCown got a few starts last year, so I don't think it's that significant of a downgrade. Frank Harris had arguably, one of his worst seasons last year, production-wise. The top 3 running backs do return. Barnes, Henry, Rocco Griffin. They combined for nearly 1,800 yards, 23 touchdowns. That's as deep of a G5 running back room in the country. Unfortunately, they lose, speaking of all-time players, they lose their all-time top wide receiver, Cephas. He's gone. Their big play guy, Kellogg, also departs. On the positive side, DeCorian Clark, who's one of their better wide receivers a couple years ago. He was injured last year. He comes back. I like their tight end, Cardenas. I like a couple more wide receivers, McCune, who was productive last year. A Texas Tech transfer, J.J. Sparkman, he impressed in the spring. So they got some guys to work with there, wide receiver and tight end. Tatafu on their offensive line returns along with two other starters. They bring in C.J. James from New Mexico, who should play center. This Missouri kid, Kamar Missouri is his name, from Rutgers. He should slide in at left tackle. So, again, they got some replacements. I mean, Traylor knows what he's doing as far as building out a roster. Last year on the defense side of the ball, their biggest strength was the ability to get after the passer, 46 sacks. That's one of the top marks in the country. Problem is they lose their best pass rusher, Trey Moore, 14 sacks last year. He transferred to Texas. Good pickup for the Longhorns. They also lose their top guy in the secondary, Cam Alexander. He transferred to Oregon. Good pickup for the Ducks. I mean, and those two guys probably start at two top 4 teams in the country. The guys I really like, rewatching tape, and I wasn't super familiar with the guys. Joseph Evans, Brandon Brown up front. Evans is 6'3", 340. Brown 6'2", 310. You don't get that kind of size too often at the G5 level. Evans graded out as their top defensive player. Those guys are impressive. Joseph Evans, Brandon Brown up front for UTSA. Again, look like it should be playing for Texas, not Texas, San Antonio. Top 2 tacklers do return. Keep an eye on Robinson on the edge. He had 11 TFLs last year. In the last few days, keeping it current, their expected starter at defensive end, Nick Booker Brown, had 6.5 tackles for loss. He was arrested on aggravated robbery and suspended. Right. I mean, we'll let the legal situation play out, but that's not good. He was, again, expected post-spring to be a starter, and this is just breaking news in the last few days. He got arrested, so not good there. Keep an eye on a New Mexico transfer, Zach Morris. No relation to the one who ended up marrying Kelly Kapowski, but they like him at corner from New Mexico. Again, Zach Morris there. Let's talk schedule. Maybe favored in as many as 10 games this year. I will say, kind of a couple tricky games early. Obviously, Texas will be the clear underdog role for them on the schedule, but they're Texas State, East Carolina, and Rice, dangerous road games in the first half of the season. If they can somehow manage through those, I mean, I think UTSA is playing in the American Championship game when it's all said and done. And they're going to be playing this team in the American Championship game. And that'll be Memphis, my top-rated as far as power ratings go team in the American this year. Memphis. Ryan Silverfield, back for year 5. I'm not a big fan. 31-18 in 4 years. Keep in mind, he inherited a program that was 38-16 the previous 4 years under Mike Norvell, so they've slipped a few games, to say the least there. Last year, though, was his best team. They're 58 in yards per play margin, 49 in yards per game margin, number 25 in scoring margin. But, was his best team, and they're okay stats-wise. I'm not sure that screams 10 wins. They're 4-2 in close games. I will say as a program, man, Memphis, I'll put I love history, all history, but college football history. I mean, Memphis was terrible for me growing up. In fact, they went to 0 bowl games from 1972 to 2002, and now they're one of only 8 schools in the country with 10 straight years of bowl eligibility. So, I mean, they really flipped the script here as of late. Good offense last year, top 15 in yards per play and yards per game. They're number 6 in scoring. Bad defense, 114th in yards per play and number 114 in yards per game. So they bring in a new defensive coordinator. He was actually on staff last year. Jordan Hankins is his name. But he did a nice job. He actually called plays in the bowl upset of Iowa State. So they promoted him as a full-time guy. In the last 2 years, speaking of roster turnover, Memphis has brought in a total of 96 new players, freshmen and transfers, the most in the American in the last 2 years. 96 new players. That's a lot. Tough to get a handle. 30 incoming transfers this year. They went all in. 13 are from power schools. 9 were starters for FBS teams. 5 were FCS starters. They just went out and got a ton of experience, productive players, brought them in. They are going all in as far as trying to be that first team to get that elusive G5 playoff berth this year in the expanded playoffs. And a big reason that's allowed them to be all in, if you haven't followed Memphis, they're getting some NIL help from a company by the name of FedEx. Maybe you've heard of them. They're located in Memphis. FedEx is giving Memphis Athletics $25 million over 5 years. So that's how they're getting some of these guys. And I'm going to talk. You're going to hear some of these names, and you're like, "Whoa, how are you getting guys like that?" Well, they got money. Takes money to get guys like this. 24 transfers, outgoing only 8 went to power schools compared to what they brought in. So again, a talent upgrade there. I will say all the roster turnover and movement, the guy that's remained the same for them is their quarterback, Seth Hennigan. He's already at Memphis the all-time leading passer in school history, nearly 11,000 yards already. Last year, 67%, 32 touchdowns, 9 picks. He had 5 rushing touchdowns. I will say he cannot get banged up. They are depth shy at the position. So as long as he stays healthy, I mean, he's going to be, when it's all said and done, one of the leading passers in the history of college football, Seth Hennigan. Blake Watson, he departs. He was their leading rusher last year and went for over 1,100 yards and 14 touchdowns. He's gone. But I thought he was impressive. But Sutton Smith is a make you miss type of, can make you miss in a phone booth type of guy. They also added Mario Anderson from South Carolina. He led South Carolina rushing last season. They got him to transfer in. Their top 2 wide receivers, Rock Taylor and Blankumsey, they returned. They nearly combined for 2,000 receiving yards last year. They're both back. A couple of their top offensive linemen unfortunately left, but they bring a couple guys back. Their right tackle, Xavier Hill, was a first-team All-American all AAC player, I should say. 3 G5 starters from last year. They got them late in the process. Best player on defense, Chandler Martin, 95 tackles, 17 TFLs. He's back. They add in Tennessee's leading tackler from last year, Elijah Herring. He comes in. Let's talk schedule. 4 toughest teams they play power rating-wise are all on the road. So I know there's a lot of publicity about this Memphis team and what they got coming back and what they brought in transfer portal. But, man, schedule-wise, Florida State on the road, South Florida on the road, UTSA on the road, Tulane on the road. That's the 4 toughest teams they play, and they're all on the road. With that being said, I mean, they got a little bit more than a South Florida and a Tulane, probably favored in 10 games. So we'll see. I expect maybe a Memphis UTSA American Championship game winner going to the playoffs unless we get a run from one of the other conferences like a Boise runs and wins more games than that. But the American, it's still okay. Obviously, you'd prefer to have Houston, UCF, Cincinnati, and SMU still in the conference, but still as of right now, when you got schools that are spending money like Memphis, like Tulane, like UTSA, you're still in good shape as a conference. Let's get to the part that you've all been waiting for. Thank you for sitting through not only this podcast, but the last 5 podcasts. My monotone, doing these solo. So I appreciate you guys. I appreciate Payne and Todd for giving me the opportunity to do these solo. But I appreciate you guys, the listeners, as far as listening to me ramble here 5+ hours here the last 5 weeks in total. But let's get you not 1 but 2 season win total best bets. We'll remain in this conference for 1. I kind of mentioned it. East Carolina. Let's go back to the Pirates, who I think could be one of the most improved teams in the country. In fact, I think from a win-loss aspect, will be the most improved win-loss team in the country this year. I think they at least triple their win total from last year. They went 2-10. Let's do the math here. Triple their win total at least. That would mean at least 6-6. So let's go ahead and look at their win total. It's 5.5. Now, this win total is all over the board. There are 3 books that have a 5.5 win total on East Carolina. You're going to go over 5.5 wins, minus 160. That's what we're going to grade this one as. Over 5.5, minus 160. DraftKings, MGM, Hard Rock. Those are the 3 that I know of that have 5.5 wins at minus 160. We're going over. If you don't have those 3 books, DraftKings, MGM, Hard Rock, you got to deal with a Circa or any of the Canby books. They are offering 6 on East Carolina at plus money. If you got to go in that direction, then I still think it's a positive EV play because I have East Carolina's season win total number projected, power ratings wise, 6.9. So of the 134 teams on the board right now, East Carolina over 5.5 and even over 6 at plus money is one of my favorite season win total bets. So East Carolina over 5.5 wins, minus 160. If you can't get that number and got to play over 6 at plus money, that's totally acceptable. We'll grade it over 5.5 at minus 160. And a few other books have it at 6.5. So I don't think a lot. Why is all the mispricing here It's because they're having a tough time handling a team that went 2-10. Probably should have won 4 or 5 games, and it's going to be much improved as far as what they brought in through the portal. So East Carolina, one of my favorite season win total bets left on the board. We got one more. Let's go back to the MAC, who at the time when I did the podcast about a month ago, there was only a couple books that had season win total numbers up for the MAC. We're going to go back to the MAC, and we're going to take an under on one of the better teams in the MAC, that being the Toledo Rockets. And you don't have to play extra juice on this one. You don't have to shop around because it's pretty much 8.5 everywhere, and it's pretty much the same juice everywhere. We'll go under 8.5 wins for Toledo, -110. Toledo under 8.5, -110. First, we'll talk pure numbers. Power ratings, I have it at 7.8. Pretty significant edge there. Why is it 8.5? Well, they're going to be favored in at least 8 or 9 games, at least, for Toledo. I have them, as far as my power ratings, an underdog at Mississippi State, at Western Kentucky, even at Northern Illinois, who I think, a sleeper team there in the MAC. Here's why I like under 8.5. They don't have hardly anybody coming back. Lose DeQuan Finn, a multiple-year starting quarterback. Lose a 1,400-yard rusher in Penny Boone. Lose all 5 starters on the offensive line. Lose only their second time in the history of the school they had a first-round draft pick, Mitchell, in the secondary. Lost their top guy up front on the defensive line. So a lot of guys, their best players by far, off the team from last year. One of the least returning production numbers in the country. And again, an 8.5 win total, pretty high for a team that lost so many good players. And finally, and most importantly, Brad, you got them favored in 9 games, and we're going under 8.5. You sure about that? Well, let's talk Jason Candle for a second. I know he somehow won 11 games last year, but let's talk the previous 4 years prior to last year. This guy, Jason Candle, in those 4 years combined, lost 9 times as a touchdown plus favorite. Lost outright. Not didn't fill a cover. Lost the game outright 9 times in the previous 4 years as a big favorite. So just because they're favored by 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 doesn't mean you're safe with old Jason Candle as the head coach. So, yeah, he somehow won the games he was supposed to last year, but history says he doesn't. He's usually good for 1 or 2 or even 3 in a season as far as losing as a big favorite. So let's go ahead. Once again, Toledo, under 8.5 wins, -110 there. And East Carolina, over 5.5 wins, -160. And again, acceptable if you got to play over 6 at plus money there. That'll do it as far as the Group of 5 series preview. Again, Todd Fuhrman, Payne Insider. You missed them. I missed them. They are back next week as we break down the ACC. You guys have a great week. Thank you once again for listening to me the last month.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of Bet the Board. Make sure you follow Todd and Payne on X. Todd is at Todd Fuhrman. That's TODDFUHRMAN. And Payne is at Payne Insider. That's PAYNEINSIDER. Don't forget, our weekly newsletter comes with an additional best bet. Have that delivered to your inbox by clicking the link atop the podcast show notes. And most importantly, subscribe and download Bet the Board. We're on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Wondery, YouTube, Google Podcasts, and all your other major platforms.